The French army went into 1917 with a much better outlook than they did going into 1916. After the titanic attritional campaign of Verdun, which, by its end, totaled over 1 million casualties, the French army managed to break through the German lines and achieve a victory, although a Pyrrhic one. One of the architects of France's victory at Verdun was General Robert Nivelle. Nivelle would replace Joffre as commander of the French army on the Western Front on the 12th of December 1916, and made grand promises for victory going into 1917. Among the Western powers, there was a desire to find a magical formula that would produce a quick victory, no more nibbling at the German lines as Joffre had advocated for, and more dynamic political leaders, such as David Lloyd George, would emerge in this atmosphere of victory. In late 1916, the first mentions of peace were publicly circulated in French newspapers, and many soldiers believed that the end of the war was near. Nivelle presented an ambitious plan to Lloyd George in mid-January of 1917, proposing a heavy artillery barrage on a small sector of the front in the Chemin-des-Dames Ridge, Aisne, and the Champagne region in April 1917, hoping to break through the German lines and end the stalemate within only 48 hours. Once a breakthrough had been achieved, previously uncommitted reserves would take advantage of the French elan and break the stalemate on the Western Front. Even before the offensive began, things were not boding well for the Western Allies. On the other side of Europe, in early 1917, the Tsarist government of Nicholas II in Russia collapsed, with the emperor abdicating his throne, and Russia falling into political chaos as various political groups vied for power. That same month in March, the German army withdrew to the Siegfried Line, which was hailed as a victory by the Allied powers, but in effect made a lot of French preparations for the coming offensive obsolete. Furthermore, in February, just 2 months before the planned offensive, Nivelle was concerned with the distribution of pacifist propaganda among soldiers and asked the Minister of War, General Lotte, to investigate rumors that French soldiers were associating themselves with syndicalists. Early in March, Lotte and the Briand government were ousted from power and were replaced by Paul Pontlevé as Minister of War by the new Ribot administration. This new administration did not have the same enthusiasm regarding Nivelle's project as the previous one did, and Nivelle was forced to seek enthusiasm amongst British politicians. Nivelle faced another setback, with weather postponing the offensive twice, which allowed the Germans to capture a complete set of plans for the French offensive on April 6th. The element of surprise, on which Nivelle relied so heavily on for the success of his offensive, had now completely disappeared. Nevertheless, Nivelle was not deterred, and at 6 a.m. on April the 16th, 1917, the offensive began. .5,300 French guns began a massive creeping artillery barrage, supporting 49 infantry divisions and 5 cavalry divisions in their attack. Nivelle had placed a lot of faith in the capability of the creeping barrage, a tactic that had brought him success in Verdun, and he believed it would bring him similar success here. Initial reports of great advances and large groups of prisoners captured were rumoured to be false, and that the French army had in reality suffered a horrific defeat. The Germans, anticipating the massive preliminary bombardment, abandoned their frontline positions, opting instead to hold from more fortified positions behind the front lines. Nivelle had, in effect, copy-pasted the tactics used at Verdun at Chemin-des-Dames. What he had failed to account for, however, was that this offensive was on a much wider front, and, as earlier mentioned, the Germans had already known of the French attack beforehand. The Nivelle Offensive also saw France utilize tanks on a large scale for the first time during the war, but breakdowns and other design flaws in the tanks rendered them ineffective. Casualty-wise, the offensive thus far had not differed radically from previous actions in the war. The offensive initially had grand expectations of a major breakthrough, but as the casualties mounted and reports began to come in over the first 2 days, the French High Command scaled down their expectations from April 22nd, settling for the same kind of tactical gains that Joffre had viewed as victories prior to his dismissal. The French ran into heavier German defences than expected, and the initial artillery barrage in some sectors was not as successful as anticipated. In other areas, however, such as the French attack on either side of the Scarpe River, which penetrated 5.5 kilometers, was the largest advance since the onset of trench warfare. Nivelle then announced that the new French objective was to hold the high ground near Reims and occupy the plateau on the Chemin-des-Dames ridge. His grand offensive had petered out into yet another meat grinder, with promises that it would break the stalemate and restore movement on the Western Front failing to realize, and it became no different to the battles of 1915 or 1916. On the 9th of May, well beyond the initial 48-hour time frame, and after 187,000 French, 160,000 British, and 5,183 Russian casualties, the offensive was finally called off. Heading into this battle, French soldiers were riding high off their success at Verdun, and were as confident as their commander in their belief of final victory. Although Nivelle failed to generate enthusiasm amongst French politicians, that enthusiasm did transfer over to the lower ranks of the army. A report from the French Third Army read, "We were in a gay temper before the retreat of the Boche, because the Americans were going to march with us. Perhaps the war was coming to an end." This enthusiasm was immediately dashed when casualties mounted, and it was clear that the offensive had failed to achieve its goals, with soldiers becoming weary and morale plummeting. By the end of April, French soldiers expressed great discouragement with the offensive, reflected in their letters to loved ones and in reports by company commanders. French soldiers complained of poor artillery coordination that had resulted in friendly fire, poor weather, and poor leadership by the French High Command. In spite of this, the offensive had continued largely without incident for the month of April. In early May, however, things would change. On May the 3rd, the 2nd Colonial Infantry refused to go into the line, and shouts of "Down with the war" and "Death to traitors" sung out, but were quickly silenced. On May 20th, a more serious rebellion occurred amongst the 32nd Corps, who refused to move into the line. Shouts of pacifist slogans rang out, and many soldiers began singing the Internationale. One soldier in the 36th Infantry Regiment wrote the following demands in a letter to his uncle. 1. Peace and the right to leaves, which are in arrears. 2. No more butchery, we want liberty. 3. On food, which is shameful. 4. No more injustice. 5. We don't want the blacks in Paris and in other regions mistreating our wives. And 6. We need peace to feed our wives and children, and to be able to give bread to the women and orphans. We demand peace. Peace. An officer in the 85th Regiment reported that his soldiers wanted more rest, less time between leave periods, and less drills when resting behind the lines. His men also complained of repeated failed operations, and some even demanded peace. The demands of soldiers were both political and material in nature. Although many soldiers were influenced by socialist pacifism, anti-capitalism, major strikes in Paris in May, and the Russian Revolution, most soldiers were protesting not to bring about a revolution, but to attract the government's attentions to the needs and fighting conditions of the soldiers. As one soldier in the 36th Infantry Regiment put it, it was to attract the attention of the government in making them understand that we are men, and not beasts to be led to the abattoir to be slaughtered. The mutinies took various forms, including desertion, insults and violence towards superior officers, drunken riots, street demonstrations, signed soldier petitions to their commanding officers, and collective attempts to march on Paris by various units. The most common form of protest, however, was simply a refusal to attack. Soldiers were willing to fight, but they were not willing to engage in suicidal attacks on the German lines. Soldiers from both the 36th and 129th Infantry Regiments summarized this feeling by stating that, as long as they are here, the Boche shall not pass. Most protests were resolved through peaceful means, with commanding officers negotiating peacefully with their men, attempting to calm them down rather than use force, as the officers were outnumbered by the mutineers. There were instances where force was used and mutineers were shot by their commanding officers, but these were isolated events. One famous example was of the 1st Russian Brigade, who refused to go into battle, and were surrounded by their fellow Russian brigades who shelled their positions until they surrendered to authorities. On May 16th, Nivelle was sacked and General Philippe Pétain replaced him. Contrary to popular belief, Pétain did not immediately calm things down upon gaining command, and the mutinies in fact spread once Nivelle was sacked, peaking in early June with 19 mutinies in a single day on the 2nd of June. From June 8th, the army began to crack down on the mutineers. Mass arrests were followed by mass trials, and 3,247 soldiers were court-martialed. Of those cases, 2,878 were sentenced with hard labor, and 629 were handed death sentences, although only 49 executions were actually carried out. For the most part, punishments were quite lax. Pétain then offered troops two incentives to improve morale. First, he promised them regular and longer leave, and second, an end to grand offensives until the Americans arrived in large numbers with tanks and infantry. For the time being, Pétain only launched limited attacks where French victory was likely. Reforms were also made to soldiers' food and rations, and leave policy was altered. The demonstrations by the soldiers had effected real change in army policy and improved the quality of life significantly. The most important effect Pétain's measures had was to improve the morale of the men and restore their confidence in the military command. One of the biggest questions surrounding the mutinies of 1917 was why the Germans didn't do anything during this period. The French army was in complete disarray, and the Germans had received some reports that there were mutinies behind the French lines. A German offensive at this time had a real potential to rout the French army, break the stalemate, and bring about a German victory. The reasons the Germans failed to act was twofold. Firstly, German soldiers were exhausted. The Nivelle Offensive had been just as costly for them as it had been for the French, with the German army suffering 163,000 casualties, and it lacked the appropriate reserves to mount a counter-offensive. Secondly, Ludendorff, commander of the German army, was aware of the increasing revolutionary fervor in the German army, the French army, and most obviously the Russian army. He was unwilling to exploit the mutinies, as he believed an attack on a mutinying French army would have a detrimental effect on his own men, potentially exposing them to revolutionary ideas. Thus, the Germans did not act. After the war, there were significant reforms to the French military justice system, motivated largely by the events of the 1917 mutinies and the injustices carried out against French soldiers. One of the biggest achievements of these reforms was the recognition and legitimization of conscientious objector status in 1961. In summary, the grand offensive that Nivelle believed would end the war had failed to achieve its goals. It resulted in a significant amount of casualties and ended up being another bloody attritional campaign, no different to previous battles. Soldiers, disillusioned with their expectations of a final end to the war, expressed their frustrations through mutinying, which took various forms of protest from a refusal to attack all the way to marches on Paris to demand reform from politicians. Nivelle was sacked, and Pétain replaced him. After almost a month of protest, Pétain and the military authorities began to crack down on the mutinies, arresting supposed ringleaders and implementing reforms to calm the soldiers down. The French would now wait until the Americans would arrive in large numbers before attempting any major actions on the Western Front. Although the demands of the mutineers were varied, with some demanding minor material reforms and others wanting peace or revolution, it is clear that these mutinies did in fact result in a change in policy and an improvement in the soldiers' quality of life in the trenches, and the French army was saved from a complete collapse, similar to that faced by the Russians that same year.